Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Rose Morgan. I'm the Chief Executive of Heart of London Business Alliance. And today's session is a short but super focused briefing on last week's budget and what it means for businesses, what it means specifically for business rates, and then really why Heart of London Business Alliance's combined business rate is now the most credible and deliverable option for real rates reform. So we're going to try to keep the webinar concise. Please feel free to use the chat to put your questions in there right throughout the whole. Don't wait to the end. Put them in and we'll pick those up and try to answer as many of those as we possibly can. So as many as you will have seen, last week's budget, am I allowed to swear? I don't know, was interesting. And the budget tinkered around with the business rates, but the glaring omission was any real kind of structural reform. And so for, I suppose, the majority of sectors, the fundamentals just remain exactly the same and unchanged. So physical businesses, they're going to continue to shoulder the majority of the burden. The imbalance between digital and physical, that's going to continue. And frankly, the cost of business rates is just going to remain unpredictable and volatile for the foreseeable future. And so that's why we're bringing everyone together today. Earlier on this morning, we actually had a round table of trade bodies representing lots of different sectors and industries, really to look at what are we going to do about it. How are we going to push for real rates reform? And it was very encouraging. It was very disheartening to hear how the budget's going to impact on businesses right across the country, from small to large. But it was very encouraging to hear the support that they had for Heart of London Business Alliance's combined business rates proposal. And there's a real desire that came from that group this morning to establish a coalition to drive that as the single most suitable and fairest solution to rates reform. So we're going to get stuck into the detail now. I'd like to introduce Alex Shan, founder and chief exec. Yeah, I was going to say chief exec, are you? I don't know. Maybe you are both, but you're the founder and chief economist at World City Consulting. And Alex will outline really what the budget meant or means for businesses in general and the wider economic landscape. And then Paul Barnes, manager director of Addis and specialist advisor to the Heart of London Business Alliance, will cover off the business rates, the need for real rates reform, and the combined business rate model as well. So without further ado, please, Alex, over to you to talk us through the budget and basically what it means for business.
Okay, thanks, Roz. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to cheer you up, but I'll try and do my best to provide a reasonably comprehensive but simple understanding of what we think has gone on. So, by way of context, it's probably worth mentioning that business rates are very important to the government. It's probably the seventh largest tax. Last year, after reliefs, they raised about 26 billion, which is a fifth of the cost of local government expenditure. And as we all know, in the government's manifesto of last year, there was a commitment to create a fairer business rate system that protects the high street, supports investment, and is fit for the 21st century. So what we've now had is a consultation process on proposed reforms, and then the budget and various other events, which I'll touch on, which now give us a degree of emerging clarity as to how the government's changes will actually affect businesses on the ground in sort of real terms, if you will. So I just want to go through a few slides to provide a little bit of detail and then our emerging understanding of what the changes will mean for businesses such as those on the call. So Sydney, if you could go to the next slide, please. Brilliant. Okay, so the government has moved to a system of five business rate multipliers. So these are basically, in Old English, what we would call the poundage. So the percentage, if you will, of rateable value that then goes into creating the bills that businesses receive. There is a small business rate, there's the standard multiplier, there's two discounted rates for the retail, leisure, and hospitality sector, and there's now a premium rate, if you will, for businesses with a rateable value of more than £500,000. And as this slide shows, the higher rate multiplier, so that's for premises with a high rateable value, more than 500,000, will now be paying an additional 2.8 pence in the pound on top of the standard multiplier of 48p, which is roughly speaking a 6% premium. Now, the government has given itself the legislative power for that additional 2.8 to be as high as 10 pence, which is roughly 20% of 48p. It's a bit more than that, 22%. So some businesses have already sort of expressed relief that at least they haven't gone for the full 10 pence premium on those higher value hereditaments. All I would say is, careful what you wish for, because there's no reason why the government might not see 2.8 pence as a first step, and in future years be tempted to move towards that 10p premium if that's what they want to do. And then on the other side of the equation, we've now seen the creation of so-called permanent retail, leisure, and hospitality discounts. And those are of 5 pence off the standard multiplier and 10 pence off the standard multiplier, depending on what your rateable value is. And as the chart shows, or the slide shows, sorry, that discount in percentage terms is between 10 and 20%. Okay, depending on if you're a smaller value occupier, then you get a bigger discount. And if you're slightly larger, then 50 to 500,000 roughly, it's about 10%. Now, it's important to note at this point that these discounts that I've just mentioned compare with a 40% discount that many businesses were receiving in the current financial year, albeit there is a cash limit on around £120,000 on that 40% discount because of the way state aid rules work. So many businesses that were below that cash limit of relief will have seen their rates go up, their bill will go up, all things being equal, just on this measure, because they're no longer receiving 40%. On the other hand, if you're Tesco's or Boots or some of the other chains, you are no longer capped at that 120,000. So they will see overall, subject to everything else, they would in theory have seen an improvement in their position because that discount now applies to every hereditament that's eligible for it, and it's no longer capped because the state aid rule falls away. And that kind of brings us on to the crucial part of the analysis, really, which is it's fine us looking at what the discounts are and so forth, but what's fundamental to understanding how people's bills will change is a revaluation exercise the government has gone through, which I'll come on to, and then also how much income the government chooses to extract from the universe of ratepayers, right? Non-domestic ratepayers. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I mean, in a way, this slide just summarizes nicely, hopefully, the multipliers and how they're changing in line with the five that now exist. I think important to note is that the standard multiplier for this year falls from 55.5 to 48 pence, and the standard multiplier is the point of departure for the discounts and the supplements. And indeed, the small business multiplier also falls. But crucially, as we'll see in a second, because values have changed, the fact that the multiplier has gone down does not mean that people's bills will go down. Okay, and we'll show you what that means in a second. Next slide, please, Sydney. Okay, so on the question of revaluation, this now takes place more often. So which is something that industry had been calling for. Why? Because otherwise, a bit like with the council tax, you risk having these long periods of time without a revaluation, which means there's a big departure between what people are being charged and what their properties are actually worth. So I think generally speaking, having revaluations is seen as a good thing because it keeps the amount people are paying at least more connected to the actual rateable values or the market rateable values, the notional rateable values of their properties. And so what we're looking at now is the new ratings list from April 26, which is now available and published, and you can go and look up what's happened to your rates on there. That's been published. It's based on April 2024 values. Okay. And the previous one was based on April 2020 values, where a lot of businesses, particularly in retail, hospitality, and leisure, had actually seen their rateable values depressed because of COVID. So that's another factor in the equation in terms of how the revaluation has played out. And as you can see from the summary table there, and these are figures for across England and Wales. Let's not talk about Wales too much, not because we don't love them, but because they set their own rates, but it's based on a single valuation exercise. You can see that rateable value change. So this is before any change in what people are paying, right? Or any change in the poundage. The fundamental underlying values have changed as shown in the table. And you can see that the change varies from nearly 28% the case of industrial and logistics to minus 0.6 to 9.3% for retail, somewhere in the middle for offices, 6 to 10%. And overall, our estimate is that the change in valuation values is about 20%. Okay, and these are all nominal term figures. So we'd expect this a bit because of inflation and various other things, but that's what's happened to the underlying values that the government uses to then calculate its bills. Okay, next slide, please. There's not many more, so bear with me because we're nearly there. Okay, so we've talked about um, what the government's done to reform the system. We've talked about what's happened to valuations. The third crucial component is how much the government is looking to extract from this source of tax. And currently, the gross target of income for this year is about 34 billion gross. Now, after reliefs, which are for small businesses and various other discretionary items, the net amount the government is looking to raise is about 28 billion or 27.8 billion. And the figures from OBR, I think, show that for next year, the government's gross target has gone up from 34 to 37.4. And if you look at the ratio for the sake of argument between net of reliefs and gross for this year, and you apply that to next year, let's say, it gives you a figure of about 31 billion. So that's a 10% increase in nominal terms. It's probably quite conservative actually in how much money we think the government wants to extract from non-domestic rates. Okay. So if you now take the combined effect of the multipliers we've been talking about, the fact there are now five of them, plus the revaluation exercise, which has led to this 20 odd percent increase in the value of the properties being valued, and then the higher target for how much money the government wants to extract, what that means is, despite a notional presentation of permanent relief or discounts for retail, hospitality, and leisure in particular, many companies, many occupiers will see their bills increase way above the rate of inflation. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the figures in this table, but what they do is just give you an illustration of how, in cash terms, bills between this year and next year may change, taking those factors into account. The two caveats here are these are averages across England, possibly England and Wales, but they're averages. So they don't take into account how things will change in London, which we'll touch on. And secondly, there are reliefs associated with transition to limit the scale of impact. So I think the maximum impact any business can face, I think, is 40%, okay, in 1 year. But it does give you an indication of how businesses, the sorts of impacts businesses are going to see, particularly once transitional relief has been phased out. And as you can see, in some cases, these figures are going to be 65%, 28%, and so forth. Okay, next slide, please. I think this is the final one. So to sort of conclude, really, the government, we would say, has largely followed through on its reforms as proposed pre-budget, under pressure, arguably from big food industry, big retailers in particular. It stepped back from a very big increase in that higher multiplier supplement we were talking about. So it's gone for 2.8 pence, could have gone for 10 pence. Um, the discounts in the multipliers for lower value occupiers, particularly in retail, hospitality, and leisure, are much less than the 40% enjoyed in 25-26. We saw there sort of 18%, 10% or so. Um, Notwithstanding the fact that this cash cap, which I talked about, has now been removed. And the combined effect of these things means that many companies that thought they were going to see a reduction in their bills will actually see a cash increase. And you will have probably seen in the papers that pubs and restaurants, to a certain extent, hotels are seeing big increases in their bills. I mean, the national impact on just on rateable values for hotels is a 76% increase. And that just wipes out a lot of the other changes that we've been talking about. And then finally, in central London, the analysis we did before we had these figures suggested that a small number of businesses in central London with very high rateable values were likely to shoulder the biggest part of the burden for reliefs for smaller firms in the country. We haven't got the exact figures on that, but we still, given everything we do know, that's still likely to be true, albeit that the scale of that burden might be a bit more modest than what we were previously estimating. And the other thing I just wanted to add is that in some cases, some of the industries or businesses that were being targeted by the government, the distribution centers that provide for online shopping, some of those will actually see their rates fall under the changes. So Amazon, that has a massive Telford distribution center, fulfillment center, which serves London, will actually see a reduction in their bill next year because of the way these two, three factors we've been talking about interact. And that was the government's intention in its manifesto, was to say those businesses should pay more. Now, some will pay more, but some will pay less, including Amazon. And as a concluding thought, really, which provides a path into what Paul's going to probably talk about, is I think it's hard to imagine that this is now the settled version of business rates. And I think that the government will be under pressure to make further reforms because of the way in which all of these changes, however well intentioned, have played out in terms of the bills that will be dropping onto businesses' proverbial doormats in April of next year. And that's back to Ros and the team.
Alex, thank you very much. Um, I think you explained that incredibly well. Because when the budget was being announced, apart from me trying to chat GBT the OBR paper and listen to the budget at the same time, my mind was exploding with all these variations of multipliers, and it was very hard to genuinely understand the outcome. I know that there's still more to unpick, um, but I think the biggest shock for me personally was the very people that government had intended on helping, which is RHL, are some of those that are going to experience the biggest hit. And I know that we've got people on the webinar as attendees that have major concerns and they're in the hotel industry. But the fact that the government is under pressure is a good thing for us because we have a solution, don't we, Paul? That will win them a lot of votes because let's face it, I think that budget was a pro vote, not a pro-growth budget. But joking aside, we absolutely have a solution that we believe that will balance fairness, sustainability, and I suppose creating something that's modern and that can be used in the future. So over to you, Paul. I think you're going to focus on the combined business rates and the need for this business rates reform. And perhaps, Paul, you can also touch on our intention to grow this coalition to support our ambition.
Thank you, Ross. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Alex, for a nice sort of segue to say you can't believe this is the end of
Mm.
rates reform under this government. The good news is, fairly good news, is that the government's made it very clear that they are now open for more discussions about business rate reform within this Parliament. So that's opened the door for us and others to come forward and say, here's some solutions. We held just today, early this morning, just 1 week after the budget, a workshop where we pulled together many of the industry bodies, trade bodies, and others who have a real interest in business rates to talk to them about our proposal for combined business rates, which I'll explain in a second. And the reason we were able to do that within just a week of the budget and suddenly have a sort of oven-ready solution is because what has happened is what we predicted would happen a year ago, when we saw the consultation that came out back in November last year, and we started working with Heart of London Business Alliance to look at a response to it. And our first response to it was, how can we respond to something when there's no impact assessment, so we don't know what the impact's going to be? So we worked alongside with Alex and others to put together an impact assessment that was pretty horrific in terms of what it would do. And therefore, HOLBA's response to the consultation was, this can't be good for London. We need a different solution. But because HOLBA always likes to be positive, instead of simply saying this is not good enough, we object, what HOLBA asked us to do was to come up with a solution that would work. And it's a project that we've been working on for many months, building on many years' experience. So we did have ready for when the budget came out and the results of the changes in the business rates payments came through. We were expecting it, and we're ready for it. So that's where we are. The reason why we thought it wouldn't work and have been proved right is because it goes back to what Alex said before about the government trying to raise a fixed sum of money every year from business rates. The reason the Treasury loves business rates is because of two things. Firstly, it is easy to predict, because unlike other business taxes, which are, percentage of your staff costs or a percentage of your profit, this isn't a percentage of anything. This is just a set figure, and they want that money in. They will get their 37.8 billion, whatever, and it's also very difficult to avoid because you can't hide the fact that you're in a building. So the government has got a predictable block of money coming in that is not affected in any way by the state of the economy. So what that means is that effectively we've got a zero-sum game, because everybody on the rating list has to pay into that, and the multipliers are set so that when you combine it with the rateable values, as Alex has just said, you get a figure for every business, and all those figures added up will come to 37.4 billion. And it is a zero-sum game. So if you give some benefits to one part of the economy, you take it, the others have to pay for it, because the government will get its set amount of money. Now, what this means is that there is a difficulty within the business rate system, because simply trying to get discounts for one group or exemptions for another doesn't ease the burden of business rates on business, it just spreads it around. And what's happening is that the system can't cope with it. The system was built, designed and launched in 1991, where the then government was using the valuation of the property that a business works in as a sort of idea for how much they should contribute to the business rate total. Now, that worked in 1990 because most businesses, virtually all businesses, worked out of a building of some form, and there was 0% digital part sector in the economy. That was in the days before the internet had grown, and everybody was working in a sort of bricks and mortar buildings and businesses. In the 35 years since, the digital economy element of the digital sector of the economy has grown to over 20%. And with its still continuing to grow, and with the introduction of AI, it's probably going to grow even more. And what's happening is that the businesses that rely on property heavy, are paying the bills. And through no fault of their own, it's just part of the business, the way their sector works. The digital sector, which is property light, pay substantially less because they just don't use property. In other words, a system that was designed when everybody used a certain amount of property now doesn't work when an increasingly large sector of the economy doesn't use property so much. So there is the problem, because what's happening is year after year, the tax base for business rates is shrinking. So originally in 1990, 100% were using property-heavy buildings or property-heavy businesses. Now it's only 80%. Maybe by 2030, it'll be 70%. The issue is that tax base is declining year on year of those who are heavier users of property, at the same time as the government is increasing that level of money that they want. So it was 34 billion they wanted in 25-26. The figure that's been set for this coming year is 37.4 billion. And the OBR tells us that by 2030, that figure will be up to 42 billion. So the amount raised is going up, and the amount of the tax base is going down. So what we looked at was to say the problem is the tax base, because the tax base is shrinking, and therefore smaller numbers of businesses paying large amounts of money. And what you need to do is not get rid of the business rate system, because the Treasury loves the business rate system, so probably not going to happen, but to evolve the business rate system. It has to evolve so that it matches and accounts for the changes that have happened in the economy. So we've come up with a system which we call the combined business rate system, which we think is far better than the current changes that have happened in this budget. The government's objectives. The government wants to support high streets. The government wants to ensure that digital economy or digital sector businesses pay their fair share. And therefore that, they say, will level the playing field between high streets and online. And they want to create a system which is fit for purpose in a 21st century increasing digital economy. Now, we don't think that what was announced in the budget meets any of those objectives at all, but we do think that our one does. So that's why we're taking this, hopefully, to the government to say the next stage of rates reform should be our combined business rates. So what do we do? So firstly, it's based on evolving the business rate system. Secondly, it's based on a broad principle that every business should pay their fair share towards the funding of local government services. Some shouldn't be paying less, which means others have to pay more in this zero-sum game. And that we therefore need to evolve that system so that the base of it is a property-based rate. But in addition, there should be a more appropriate way of ensuring that digital sector pays their fair share. And our proposal is to introduce a 2% levy on all online sales. Now, this doesn't mean what a few years ago, government looked at bringing on an online sales tax. This is not the same, because what this is all online sales. It's not just online retail, as previously people were talking about. Every business in Britain that is making sales in Britain should be contributing their fair share to the business rate pot. Now, once you broaden it from just online retail to all online sales, a 1% levy raises £3 billion, not the £1 billion the government was talking about before. So 2% levy, which is 2% is what generally businesses pay, business rates are as part of their turnover, would raise you £6 billion. If you've got that £6 billion, and there'll be some exclusions, I'll come back to that in a second, but with that £6 billion, you could then, in order to meet the government's target that they want, you could reduce the business rate multiplier back to what it was back in 1990, when everybody said it's affordable, which was 34.8p. If we did that, every business rate payer in the country would get around about a 40% discount in their business rates, rather than the rises that they're going to get at the moment. And what a good surprise, that would raise 24 billion. The 6 billion that we'd add to from the levy is 30 billion, And as Alex has just told us, the government's target for this year was around about 28 and a half billion. So the government doesn't lose out on this because it's broadened the tax base. So that's a total 30 billion against that projected 28 billion. It's definitely a more simple system because with the online sales, all you would do is use the existing VAT system in order to assess how much sales have been made online. That, by the way, would exclude all smaller businesses who aren't VAT rated, and it would also allow you to collect the money as well using the same systems. You don't have to invent a new tax system. It's already sitting there. It's not. This levy is definitely a sales levy. It's not VAT, but it would use that system to be collected. And if you did manage then to reduce the business rate multiplier to what it was in 1990, you wouldn't need all the additional add-ons that have been brought in over the years to protect those businesses that simply can't afford the increasing cost of business rates. So instead of now going up to 5 multipliers, you could possibly go back down to 1. I mean, that's all in the detail, but it makes it much simpler than the government's proposing to do. And you wouldn't need any legislation because it could all be done under the finance bill. So it's a system that's easy to use. It's fair. It includes everybody, and it's very easy to put into place. I just want to come back and say on that 2% levy, there are some exceptions to that. Firstly, you exclude all the financial services because that's a whole different ballgame. So we don't get mixed up with that. So that's excluded. But we'd also look, and again, there's lots of detail to go into, at excluding those online sales that actually help and support the high street. So what is it that's sold online that brings people into town and city centres? Click and collect. You don't charge a levy on that because that brings people in. Theatre tickets. Everyone who buys a theatre ticket does come into a town city centre. Even UK hotels, we could exclude them from it as well. Your air flights would be excluded because if it's based on VAT, they don't pay VAT, they pay passenger duty. So there's groups that get excluded from this, but you still would raise that £6 billion and you would be doing more to protect the high street. So that's our proposal. It's at a high level proposal and based on those clear principles of everybody paying the same amount and evolving the current system so that it matches the changes that have taken place in the economy over the last 35 years. We met, as I said earlier, with various representatives of trade bodies today and had a long discussion. The general agreement is something has to be done. This can't be the end of it, which is great. And there was general support, but look at the detail for the principle of where we're going. And we're looking now to take that forward and possibly form it into a national campaign. Very pleased that the Association of Town and City Managers, so it gives you that national spread, have said this is their future. This is what they will be pushing for. And we're talking to other trade bodies to get them on board to the extent of possibly launching a national campaign on this in the early part of the new year, especially when Christmas is out the way and especially retailers and hospitality can have a little bit of relax after the Christmas period. So there's where we are. We see this as we had predicted, that the budget would be the start of our process, not the end of it. We were all prepared for it, and our predictions came true largely, and that demonstrates the robustness of what we're proposing. And now with the government giving the green light to further business rates reform, I think our stage now takes place where we go and say, what you didn't really do the job. It's caused a lot of problems. It hasn't helped high streets. It hasn't created a level playing field with the digital sector. You've said there's going to be more change to come. We want you to take this change that we're proposing seriously. Thank you.
Great, Paul. Thank you very much. Again, a really good analysis and I think a really succinct description of our proposal. And I think ultimately the point is clear. We need real structural reform with business rates, and the combined business rate that HOLBA is putting forward genuinely is a fair, modern and deliverable reform model. And a lot of work has already gone into that. I'm just looking to see whether there's any questions, but while I'm checking that, anybody that's online that is listening to this live or actually listening to this on recording later on, we invite you to join us in this campaign. And so if you are interested, please get in touch directly. The momentum's already there, as Paul said. We had a huge group of trade bodies together this morning, very keen to push forward with this. And we want to demonstrate that this is not a West End thing, a London thing, or a very specific sector industry challenge. This is something for the whole country to concern itself with. And I think it's something that all industries and services can get behind. So let me just check to see whether there are any questions that have come through. If not, that means that Alex and Paul, you've done a sterling job of explaining everything and everybody understands it all. Am I looking in the right place? Let's just check. Q&A. I was looking in chat instead of Q&A. Okay. Do you think the government knows how angry hospitality businesses are about the business rate increases? Who'd like to answer that?
I think they're going to learn. We've already seen, for example, UK hospitality saying two things. Firstly, we should revisit the multipliers now. I don't think, I might be wrong, but I think that's quite difficult to do because the government has now set in train the process for local authorities to start doing their business rates analysis and get their bills out in time for April. Subsequently, I think they've called for a moratorium on everything until the end of this 3-year period of revaluation. Again, I think that's difficult to do because the numbers don't add up. If you start unpicking it now, you've got to change those multipliers because, again, this is a zero-sum game. So if you start making it better for some groups, it's going to make it harder for others. And I would have thought judicial reviews will be flying all over the place on that. The people who, is the government aware? I think they are being made aware of it. And in particular, it would be part of our role to do that. It's the impact on the high street. That's the key thing. I think people are feeling let down because the whole reason for this new change and these new multipliers was to protect the high street. And it was to make permanent the discount that high street businesses have had at some level since COVID. And this year, that level of discount is 40%, with a cap on, as Alex was saying, it's 110,000. Now, everyone was led to believe, and this is the only place where our predictions were wrong, but the principle of our predictions was firm. We were led to believe that would mean a 40% discount for businesses in the high street. Everyone thought that, and it would be funded by an increased multiplier on bigger businesses. What's of course happened is that discount's gone down from 40% to around 10%. So it's not so much the valuation and the multiplier and everything, it's the government has virtually taken away that discount. And that's where the high streets are going to suffer because ironically, the businesses that got the most out of those discounts were smaller businesses because it was capped at 110,000. So if you're a supermarket chain, the most you could claim was 110,000, which is virtually nothing when you think of all the supermarkets there are. But if you're a small business and you've just got one business in a town centre, you got your full 40%. So when the government has now just removed that 40% and pulled it down to 10%, that makes no difference to Tesco's at all. But they're benefiting because they've seen all the other multipliers come down. So they're going to be saying this is actually quite good. But for the small shops and restaurants and such like and hotels, they've seen effectively a 30% rise. So I think, given how sensitive politicians are to the calls from their local businesses, I think that when their MPs go back to their constituencies and spend time there during the Christmas break, they will start to realise quite what an impact this is and how it hasn't met the government's objectives. In which case, that's when we're starting and saying, we've got an answer to this problem for you.
And I think, Paul, this was specific to hospitality businesses. I think the combination of how hard they've been hit, and then the announcement of the mayor's been given permission to introduce a tourist tax, which I appreciate is on visitors, but ultimately the businesses have to administer it, which costs money. I think the timing of that was pretty poor. And that only exacerbates the frustration and the anger that I've certainly heard from our business and specifically hospitality community. And we might want to do a separate webinar on that as the facts of that come through. But just leading on to another question here, it's were there any winners from this round of business rates reform?
It's a zero-sum game, as I keep saying. So if the high street businesses were losers, then someone's been a winner.
Yeah,
I think it's slightly different from that. I think businesses are classing it as a win, that it's not as bad as they thought it was going to be. So
exactly.
it's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
that they're getting lower business rate bills. They thought some of those big businesses, especially those over 500,000, which were going into this new higher value multiplier, thought they were going to get, a 10% increase on the current multiplier, which, is effectively a 20% increase in their rates bills. That hasn't happened at all. And the reason it hasn't happened is because the government doesn't need the money, because it's not actually providing all that big discount for high street businesses. So they were probably expecting a huge impact, and it's not as bad as they think it is. The people who got on the other side are the ones who were expecting a big discount, and they didn't get it. So, the winners are those, I think, who were expecting it would be worse, and it's not as bad as they expected, but it's still worse than it is today, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I don't know whether any of us can answer this because none of us are politicians, but politically, how can government justify the huge increases when they actually claim they wanted to help the high street?
I think that's a question that if people on the Treasury Select Committee next week, when they take the Chancellor, they should ask her. The Chancellor has made it very clear. I mean, you can quote her word for word. It says,
Uh-huh.
we will change business rates to support the high streets, and we will create a level playing field with the digital sectors in order that we can fund, their business rates will go up to fund the discount. Absolutely not happened. Not happened. And I'm sure that to someone, Alex probably, who's planning to write a book on the history of business rates at some stage, and one of the questions I'm sure you'd be fascinated, Alex, is what on earth went on in the Treasury
Yeah.
that, having said we're going to defend the hotels and hospitality, they are the one group that the revaluation in particular has really hit.
Yeah.
There's one hotel in central London, not far up from behind your picture here,
Mm-hmm.
Roz,
Mm-hmm.
who, their valuation, given it's a valuation every 3 years, it's gone up nearly 300%.
Yeah.
How can anyone think that a business property would go up by 300% in just 3 years? What's in people's minds? And it'd be fascinating, well, relatively fascinating, to find out why that's happened. But that's yet to come out.
So, Ross, just very quickly, I think Paul's right. I mean, I have a feeling that the Valuation Office may have changed their methodology for hotels. I think they may have changed their methodology, and that might explain why there are these very dramatic increases. And I think the industry will be looking at that to see how, if it passes a sort of reasonableness test in terms of, how the government's behaved, which is challengeable, as Paul says, through the courts in a way. The other thing I was just going to add was, in terms of the question, well, who's benefited? So, as Paul says, less bad for some, including London, by the way, overall in fiscal terms. It'll be less bad than we thought it was going to be in terms of these further transfers of wealth out of London to support the rest of the country. I guess that retailers have been less hardly hit than offices, than leisure, and indeed hotels. And for some of the retail chains where they've got relatively, if their RVs are below 500,000, because of the cash cap being lifted under the old system of reliefs, they may have actually seen some benefit. But of course, it all depends on what's happened to their valuations. So if their valuations have broadly remained similar or the same, then they'll be better off. But we won't really know until people with bigger brains and bigger computers than I've got have kind of run the numbers in some detail.
Well,
If I could just add, Roz, to that,
yeah.
is what Alex has pointed out a key thing there. The reason why hotels have been hit most is because the revaluation has changed, and it may well be the system that's done that. it won't, I don't think, be good enough for the government to turn around and say, well, the valuation office is an independent agency, and we're not going to question them, because what it's done is it's effectively negated the government's policy of supporting high street businesses. The valuation office, if that's the excuse that's being used, by putting their rateable values up, the Treasury will say, well, we got the lowest rates because the rate is effectively the multiplier. But unfortunately, your valuation went up, but that's not our fault. That's this independent body. The valuation office is government. They can't get away with that. And if that's their excuse, then government has stopped government doing what government said it wanted to do, and it can't get away with it.
So Paul, you did say that you think that because there is a question here about will government do anything to correct these high increases and address, I suppose, the frustrations and the anger. And you mentioned earlier that you believe that the doors are now open for further discussion around business rates reform.
Yes, but opened only slightly. So they need a long, big push to open them wider. They've issued a consultation paper about the impact of business rates on investment. And what
Yes.
that effectively means is, because it's based on the value of your business and you then invest in your property, then your valuation goes up, so your business rates goes up. So it's a disincentive to
Hmm.
invest. Well,
Hmm.
yeah, but that's still changing those, moving those deck chairs around. The
Hmm.
ship is sinking, and how much you change it around, because it's a zero sum game. Until you broaden the tax base, you're not going to get a positive and a good result on business rates. So their consultation is still consulting about moving the deck chairs around. We need them to move to say, we need to talk about the principle of the business rate system, evolving it so it's fit for purpose in a digital economy. And that means widening that tax base. That's the key to it. And if you're not talking about that, then you're just talking about winners and losers again.
Absolutely. And you're setting, what I've been disappointed in is some of the news stories where it's setting sectors up against sectors, industries up against industries. I just don't like that. I mean, we're a whole ecosystem, and everybody plays their part. And I think that's really disheartening whenever you see one sector argue that they deserve to pay less than another sector and all of that. So I think that Paul, definitely the conversation today with the trade bodies, they recognize that, and the time and money that's spent on just making that argument, when actually they agreed in principle that they'd rather shift their focus to something more permanent, which is why they were so attracted by the combined business rates. And we had a really good discussion around that this morning. So I'm going to finish up because there are no more questions. I'm just going to say thank you, Paul. Thank you, Alex, for that really good breakdown of a very complex arena. I think that the more times I hear it from you guys, the more I learn. I've written lots of notes, so it's probably the same for anybody that's listening. And so what we'll do is we'll share a short summary of today's briefing. Maybe some of those tables, we can share those as well. Things are still evolving, I have to say, aren't they, Alex, in terms of the absolute finite detail. The reality is we'll know what's what when the bills finally land on the doorstep, as you said earlier, Alex. We'll send information about the combined business rates. It's online, it's on the HOLBA's website if you want to see it right away, but we can send that paperwork out to you. And then, really importantly, I just want to encourage organizations to join the campaign. And again, we'll have a link online where you can sign up. At the minute, all of the commitment is just to have a conversation about it, and support HOLBA in terms of its structural reform agenda. So, without further ado, thank you everybody for your time, and have a good evening.